My thoughts on the P1S are soon to come in another video, but first I want to talk about something different. This is the 3D Benchy, and this is probably the first thing you'll print with one of these printers, or any other printer for that matter. This specific one was printed on my X1 Carbon in about 18 minutes, and it came pre-sliced. Now that pre-sliced file may or may not work for you. We'll talk about why in this video, and we'll also talk about what you can do with your slicer to get it to print a little better and a little faster. So let's get into that in this video. So first things first, let's talk about the Benchy itself. Now this is a pretty small print. It's been around for a couple years and it's been used for a lot of printers. It's almost the standard default item that you'll print with a printer because it has a lot of little features that you can use to calibrate your slicer profile. The very first thing that you'll notice is there's text on the bottom. Now this text on the bottom will test whether or not your first layer adhesion is good or not. If you have good first layer adhesion, the text will be clearly readable. But there's a couple other things that you can look for as well. If the text is readable and there are no gaps in between the layer lines on that first layer, you'll be looking for the correct amount of extrusion. So if there are gaps, you'll be under extruded. That's something that you could change with the flow setting. And that's one of the calibration tools available in Bamboo Studio and Orca Slicer. Many other slicers have calibration for flow rate as well, and you can even do it yourself. If you use a different type of printer, you may do something called calibrating e-stops. There's many different ways to calibrate the flow rate for your printers, and that's the first thing you'll look for. Other things you'll notice about a bad flow rate, maybe an inadequate flow rate, is in the hull of the Benchy. So the hull of the Benchy will actually have gaps in it if you're under extruding. And you may see that in your pre-sliced Benchy if the filament that you're using is maybe not Bamboo's official filament or something like that. You'll also see over extrusion on the corners. You'll see thick blobs. That's where the filament's kind of piling up as it goes around the corner. Now that one specifically can be affected by what's called linear advance or pressure advance, depending on the flavor of firmware that you're using. But in either case, it's going to do pretty much the same thing. It'll tune how much filament to push through the hot end as it goes around a corner. And you'll see that reflected in both the flow rate and the pressure advance value. Another couple things to look for as far as flow rate goes is if you do have over extrusion, the pipe here may not fit into the window and you may lose some details on the steering wheel inside. Now detail is going to show up as a common issue if you have over extrusion. You may find that the prints print better, and you may even find that you need to over extrude your first layer in order to get it stick really well. One last thing to look for over extrusion is there's actually text in the back of the Benchy. And I'll see if I could get a close-up of that, but you should be able to see that there is text there. If it just runs right over it, makes it completely smooth, you're probably over extruding. So I'll look at how to calibrate flow rate using Bamboo's tools in a moment, but I want to talk about the next thing you'll do. Let's say flow rate looks okay, the bottom layer is not perfect, but it's acceptable and you want to move on and you're just getting some stringing, or maybe the filament is globbing up. So the next thing you'll do is do a temperature tower. Now this is going to change based on the filament that you're using, the humidity conditions of the filament. There's a lot of factors, and you'll probably want to do a temperature tower every time you change maybe to different brands of filament, or if the filament hasn't been used for a while and now it's collected a lot of moisture, you may need to change it as well. So what is the temperature tower? So the temperature tower is a set 3D printed item that's stacked on top of each other with an incremental change in temperature. So this is the temperature of the extruded material from the hot end. And you can see in this case, this was printed with PETG on the X1 Carbon at 230 degrees. It was barely hot enough to come out, and it was clumping as soon as it was coming out of the hot end. And that's why you see this top surface is very rough. That's why there's lots of kind of stringing and globs, and it doesn't look very good. And as you go higher in temperature, you can see those features kind of clear up, and around 250 seems to be the coldest you would go to clear up those issues. So you can go all the way up to 270, and this brand of PETG actually says it should be printed from 215 to 230, which is interesting because at 230 it was not hot enough in my case. And I've dried the filament in a filament dryer, and that didn't help. So I actually need to print this PETG at 250. So don't always follow the recommendations from the manufacturer. So that's the very first thing you'll do is check the temperature, and you want to do this pretty much with any new filament. Now you may just pick a temperature that you know is going to work well for your filament depending on what type it is, if it's PLA versus PETG versus ASA or ABS. But You may end up wanting to change it based on maybe how fast you're printing or maybe even the surface finish. If you have a nice, easy shape to print that doesn't have a lot of overhangs and you want a good, strong connection between the layers as well as a glossy finish, maybe you go up here to closer to 270 and print at a higher temperature to get some of those properties. So there's not one set temperature, but there's probably a temperature that's too low and there's probably a temperature that's too high. Anywhere in that temperature range that works, in this case probably between 250 and 270, will work for my PETG, and something like that may work for you as well. But print one of these, take a look at it, and then make note of it. I keep these with the spool of PETG that I got until I finish that spool of PETG, and then I notice I have an issue as I go through other rolls of it. And once I find that I need to change it, I'll run a new temperature tower, see if it's different by 5 degrees or so, and then print a new, and then change that temperature in the filament profile. Next, you may want to look at flow rate. And like I mentioned earlier, if you're having bed adhesion issues, that may be a time that you want to address the flow rate first, but you'll want to fine tune it after you change the temperature because the volumetric expansion may change the actual flow rate as it's counted before it goes through the hot end. Sometimes filaments will actually expand when they're heated due to just normal thermal expansion. And it's because of that feature that you can't really use the same flow rate setting for every type of filament that's exactly the same. If the chemical compound's a little bit different, it may have a little bit different reaction to the thermal energy that's put into it, causing a different amount of thermal expansion, and then you'll need to tune the flow rate a little. So if you do have under extrusion on the first layer, what do you do about it? So these little cards were printed with Orca slicers and bamboo slicers new calibration mode. Effectively what you're looking for here is it's going to print a couple layers of just a solid infill, and you look at them and compare at what point you have the correct amount of extrusion. So this is really an art. You're going to look at it and say, how much extrusion do I want to see? So you don't want to see gaps, you know that's too far. And you don't want to see where the extrusion is actually bunching up and overlapping, causing high ridges. You'll normally see high ridges with over extrusion. So that's too far the other way. Somewhere in the middle, you're going to find that it's actually kind of hard to tell once you get down to plus or minus 5%. So what you want to do is find the boundaries where you think it's noticeably over extruded and then noticeably under extruded, and then shoot for the middle. That's what I do. I just take the average there because sometimes it's too hard to split the hairs between, you know, a +3 and a -3%. So take a look at these when you do your calibration, and that will tell you a lot about how to get. Now there's one last thing that you may want to test. This is a meta fabric that's 3D printed, and it has these intricate toroid kind of designs that interlock with each other, creating this 3D printed flexible material. So this is a good test for not just layer adhesion, since these are all individual parts, and if any of those fail, it won't stick, but also for retraction, because as it builds these up, each of these little arms have a small circular cross-section, and that circular cross-section is by the print head doing small circles on each of the portions, and it builds those up until it builds the final shape. So you can imagine that this type of shape will have a lot of retraction. Are still having issues and you can't print something like this, then you may need to look at retraction as well. Now what does retraction do? The intention of retraction, especially with a direct drive extruder like in the bamboo printer, isn't to actually pull the filament back. What you're actually doing is relieving the pressure off of the packet of molten filament that's inside of the nozzle. And what that does is it stops the flow of filament. So typically for direct drive extruders like on the P1S and the X1 Carbon, it's going to be around 1 to 2 millimeters, and with a speed somewhere between 25 and 35 millimeters per second. Again, you can tune those a little bit based on your filament. If it's extra oozy, you may want to do a little bit more retraction closer to 2 millimeters, and then maybe you decrease the speed a little bit to give it a little more time to cool off as it retracts. So this is a good test that you could print, and between the Benchy and then a small piece of fabric like this, you'll be able to look at your temperature, flow calibration, and then retraction settings. And once you get those set, I think you're pretty set up as far as getting a good baseline to start your slicer profile. So that's what I wanted to talk about in this video. Just comparing some of the things that you could do setting up your first printer. I know that there's a lot of new people coming into 3D printing, especially with Bamboo Lab coming on the scene with their P1P and now the P1S, which is honestly a pretty good deal for an enclosed printer. I don't think you'll find anything else that has the capabilities you'll get with that printer at that price point. I'm working on a review of both the X1 Carbon and the P1S. Those will be posted soon in the future, so keep an eye out for that. And that's all I have for this one. I'll see you next time.